Again, welcome. Appreciate everybody being on the call today. I want to remind you that only the speakers are in video and audio. So if you have a question you would like to ask us, and we'll attempt to take questions throughout the call, you can do that in the chat or the Q&A, and all of us will attempt to monitor that throughout the call. And as you just heard, the call is being recorded. So 2021 was a very busy and a very active year for both Policy and Taxation Group and Family Enterprise USA. We conducted almost 100 targeted, specific meetings with members of Congress and staff to talk about the legislation that was being proposed that would be destructive and very damaging to families and family businesses. We fought hard, and most of those provisions that we fought for were pulled out, fortunately, from the Build Back Better Act. Russ and Brandon and Mark are going to talk later about where the legislation is, where it's been, what the speculations are about what's going to happen in the future later on in the call. So first of all, I would like to just quickly go through the agenda. Frank Luntz is on the call. He's going to start to talk to us about political and policy outlook 2022. Then we're fortunate to have Dylan McGowan, who is from Congressman Don Byers' office of Virginia, who's going to also speak to us about tax policy. He's head of economic and tax policy for the congressman. Russ Sullivan's going to talk about the wins in the Build Back Better Act for families. Brandon Ramon's going to talk about the income surtax and how it relates to gift and estate taxes. And Mark Warren is going to talk about valuation discounts and other regulatory issues and where we are today and what the future looks like. So I'm going to start, as we usually do, with Frank. And Frank, turn it over to you to talk about the political and policy outlook for 2022.
Pat, thank you very much. What was, I think, most significant, and I have to be careful about what I say and how I say it, but I did have the opportunity to present to the Problem Solvers Caucus. And right now, as we approach an election year, they do matter, and they probably matter more now because they're trying to save their seats. We have redistricting going on. We already have record fundraising hauls for a number of House members and senators. We're going to spend more money on this election than has ever been spent in an off year. What is a surprise is that even though the Speaker of the House is a Democrat and the Senate Majority Leader is a Democrat, the Republicans, at least on the House side, are even in what they're raising, or even a little bit ahead, which indicates the level of intensity. I have a few bits of what I consider alarming information, and Pat, if you'll allow me, I'm going to go outside policy for one moment. Those of you who know me know how I can't stand the negativity, how I cannot. I get a physical reaction to how rough and tumble politics has become. And it is pretty clear that within the Republican primaries, over the next 6 months, it is going to be more brutal than anything that we have ever seen in American politics, including the 2016 presidential campaign. And I say this to you all because it's going to be harder and harder the closer we get to November to drive any kind of legislative agenda, to be able to speak to members of Congress, which I know many of you, if not most of you, have those kinds of relationships. It's going to be harder to talk about policy because all they're going to be talking about is politics, is the election. And it's all going to be negative. It's going to be vicious and personal. And this trend, I don't know when it comes to an end, but I'd say to you all that there are things that are more important than elections. And one of them happens to be the survival of democracy in this country and the survival of the public's faith and confidence in the electoral process, which has been severely damaged, if not permanently obliterated. So I begin there because it's a warning that I'm so glad that you got a representative from Congressman Byers' office, because we need to have Democrats and Republicans appearing together. We need to have Democrats and Republicans talking together. And that Problem Solvers Caucus is one of the most important places for you all to be, and a place for me to be, because it's a chance to share what the public really thinks about tax policy, what they really think about spending and deficits, what they really want for the next generation. And it goes back to something we learned from the research we did last year. And that is that even more important than generational, it's American dream to take something, build it up, and then pass it down to your children so they can build it up and pass it down to their children. It's the essence of what it is to be an American. And that is the number one way to describe what you all seeking to do in this legislation. It's really not about rates. And I know you're going to talk about it. It's not about the numbers. It's the idea that you are potentially destroying not just the opportunity, but the right to work hard, play by the rules, pay your taxes, and be able to take what you create and give it to your children, and for them to do the same thing and give it to their grandchildren. So that's number one, and actually number two. Third is that I've had the opportunity to meet with several of the Democratic senators who are more moderate, and to my surprise, and I say this candidly, they are determined to oppose the amount of spending that would require the amount of tax increases that would involve you all. That there is a realization that with inflation, shortages, increasing crime, chaos at the border, the issue of January 6th and what happened to our democracy, and quite frankly, what's going on in foreign policy, that to add to it, a huge increase in the debt is not what the American people want right now. And that is the strongest argument in terms of why we shouldn't raise taxes. The idea, the concept that it is better to reduce the spending, it is better to make Washington more efficient, more effective, and more accountable, that is a better approach than adding to the burden of hardworking Americans, adding to the burden of small businesses, multi-generational businesses, and the public sees that, which is why the more that Joe Biden pushes Build Back Better, the lower that his numbers fall. And in our survey research, he's now at a 39% job approval rating. To put that into context, he is now the third most unpopular president since Harry Truman at this point in his administration. And second, he's actually more unpopular today than Donald Trump was at the end of his first year. We all know how controversial that was. The public is so clearly saying no, and House members and selected House members and senators are recognizing this, and they realize that they're in trouble for their seats. I'm going to do one more policy finding or projection, one more political projection. The political projections first. The most likely, as we look at redistricting, which has actually been a slight net positive for the Democrats, not the Republicans. You may note that I acknowledged back this time a year ago that based on the population numbers, that this was would be a very good census for the Republicans. What we did not know at the time was where that population most increased. So if you were to rerun the 2020 election in 2024, the Republican candidate would begin with +8 electoral votes, even if he or she were to win exactly the same states in exactly the same proportions, there'd be an additional 8 Republican seats because it's Republican states that are growing. However, where they are growing is in urban and suburban areas, which is good for the Democrats, particularly urban areas. And where populations are shrinking is in small towns and farming areas. And even though these are Republican seats that are gaining in population, Democratic areas are gaining. And based on the legislatures, it looks like the Democrats will, in the end, have a net gain, an actual gain of about 3 seats in the House just because of redistricting. Now, I say that because in our polling, the Republicans have a 4-point generic ballot advantage. And with the redistricting, the way that it happens, when you apply that to the generic ballot, that's a Republican majority at this point of about 25 seats. So, Pat, I know that your people ask political questions all the time. You got policy people on this call that know it better than I do. Politically, if the election were held today, the Democrats will keep the Senate because their candidates, quite frankly, are stronger and are in safer seats than the Republicans. They'll keep it by 1, maybe 2 seats. And the Republicans are very likely, I use that terminology specifically, are very likely to regain control of the House. So you're looking at a split government. And the last thing I want to mention about policy are 2 words for you. And I do this in language because that's my specialty. And that's what I try to bring to this conversation. It is essential that you represent common sense. It's not moderation. It's not being a centrist. They're looking for common sense and responsible government, responsible tax policy. As you talk about these tax issues, whatever you care about, you wrap it around common sense and responsible politics or responsible policy. That is exactly where the American people are located, and it does much better than any other attribute. And one more point, because I know I'm running long now. What they're looking for is a detailed plan of action. How does your priorities best fit into a detailed plan of action to address all those issues that we talked about? Because one more reason why the Democrats are in serious trouble. The public did not start to understand inflation until Thanksgiving. They did not start to really hate it until Christmas. The moment when they were paying more money for gas to travel to grandma's house, when they were paying more money for gifts, particularly the used car for their kids, when they were paying more money for housing for themselves, when everything started to cost more, they personalized it. To ask the American people to pay more in taxes after they are already paying more for everything that they use, for everything that they consume, is a real vote loser. And that, along with the other language that I've discussed here, is how to communicate why the public, or why the public is against raising taxes on this group of people in this way. So Pat, I'll throw it to you if you want to ask me a question, or anyone else in the chat room wants to do so.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Am I missing anything or in the Q&A at this point? So please put your questions for Frank in there. My question for you, which is, I know it's a big question, is, and you and I have talked about this, we did the work last year that was so important on voter attitudes, is it does really seem that democracy is at risk. And the Problem Solvers Caucus is so important, as you pointed out, and we're spending a lot of time meeting with them, talking to them. But can they really make a difference in the voter? Because the voter they're so discouraged. They're so discouraged about where our democracy is and where it's headed. And they see this political divide, and it doesn't seem like it's getting any better, Frank. It seems like it's getting worse.
It is.
And I don't know what can turn it around. What can turn it around?
Politicians who put the country over partisanship, over ideology, and frankly, we failed under Trump. We're failing under Biden. I do not wish to be partisan. I actually wish in essence, a pox on all their houses, because they seek the electoral advantage rather than doing really what the vast majority of the American people want, which is to get it done. It's exactly why the public supported the infrastructure package, but not all the extemporaneous, all the extra programs that are added on to score political points for certain districts and certain voters back home. They want money for roads, for bridges. They want money for education. They want investments in health and safety, but they don't want these special interest projects. And they were all tacked onto that legislation. And as the voters learn about it, they become much more concerned. So Pat, the only way we're going to get a change is if we get politicians who want to do it differently. If we say that what we saw in 2020 is the worst of America, not the best. If people who ran as centrist, or instead, and I'll answer Linda Mack's question in a moment, and also Scott Marshall's. Okay, now they're coming in. We're going to end up with the government that we deserve. We're going to end up if we don't have the right politicians running, which is why, Pat, of all the people, you have two of them, Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. These are two people who are standing up to the leadership of their party, standing up and saying no, being willing to compromise, being eager to come to the table. They've been clear about this. They're not saying we will kill this. They're saying we can't do it as it is now. That's exactly the kind of politics that the public is looking for. That's exactly the kind of behavior that they want. And on your issue that matters, will term limits make a difference? Well, first off, you actually have to pass it. So you have to introduce it where it passes in 38, I believe, of the 50 states, because it is a constitutional amendment. It needs three-fourths of the states, and it needs 2/3 of the vote in the House and Senate. And an awful lot of politicians won't vote for it. Let me tell you something. When I first started to work on term limits back in 1994, it had the support of 71% of the public. Now, in 2002, it has the support of 78%, almost 80% of the public, because they're fed up. They're mad as hell. They're not going to take it anymore, and they would vote for it. And then the other question was, what do I project for voter turnout? I think we'll have the same situation in 2022 that we had in 2018 and 2020, which is record voter turnout for an off-year election. I don't know how many of you realize, but 2020 was the highest voter turnout in 100 years in a presidential campaign. Because if you love Trump, if you hated Trump, you voted. And the idea that we are denying or suppressing, limiting the vote is simply ridiculous. It's not accurate. Everyone who wanted to vote could vote on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. You could vote by mail. You could vote in person. You could vote early. You could vote on election day. And everyone did. And I think we're going to have the same equivalent turnout, that we will actually, more people will vote in 2022 than voted in 2018. And the last one, how it will affect the outcome of the election. I think it's particularly important in Senate races, because that's where the population actually does know who their senators are. And the reason why I think that Democrats will keep the Senate is that you have a battle right now between Donald Trump and some of these Republican Senate candidates. And that is sure death for the GOP. Whether you like Trump or dislike him, the truth is he is a major factor in elections, a major factor in turnout. And if he's fighting with the endorsed candidate, if he's in a brawl, as he is with Mitch McConnell right now, that will have a meaningful, measurable impact on Republican turnout. It will hurt Republicans. And in fact, I think the only way that Republicans could win the Senate, and the only way that they could lose the House, is if Donald Trump continues to be in fights with the Republican voters, with the Republican leadership, with the Republican Party people, with Republican members of Congress. He could snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory if this continues.
Any other questions for Frank? Thank you, Frank. I don't see any in the chat or the Q&A. Thank you so much for all your insights, Frank. They're very, very valuable. We always appreciate them, and everyone on this call should know that we continue to work with Frank on a regular basis in 2022. And so we're really encouraged with what he has to say, and the fact that he's working with the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is so important. Thanks again, Frank.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye. Next, I'm going to ask Rodney Emery from the Brownstein Law Firm. I'm sorry, Squire Patton Boggs. Sorry, Rodney.
No worries.
Squire Patton Boggs, to introduce Dylan McGowan.
A pleasure, Pat. Welcome, everyone. Dylan McGowan is a legislative assistant for Congressman Don Beyer of the Virginia delegation. Congressman Beyer is a member of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, and Dylan is responsible for managing the Congressman's House and Ways and Means portfolio, which includes tax, trade, financial services, and foreign policy issues. By way of background, Dylan is a graduate of Columbia University And he's also earned his master's from the London School of Economics. So we're honored to have Dylan take time out of his calendar to join us today.
Thanks, Rodney, and thanks, Pat. So I'll just give you, kind of a broad overview of where things stand in the Ways and Means Committee regarding Build Back Better and the other priorities we're working on. So it will come as no surprise to all of you that BBB has stalled. There have been a variety of other priorities that have taken, that have kind of jumped the line. So right now, appropriations, sort of in the background is the China bill, the Innovation and Competitiveness bill that's also known as the America Competes Act. And then a few weeks ago was election reform. And so, in Ways and Means, at least, we are not privy to whatever negotiations are going on right now between, senior officials and really Senator Manchin. I think Ro Khanna and other members have said, the Democrats have been banging our heads against the wall, trying to figure out what Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema will accept. At this point, I think the strategy now is to just kind of quietly let those negotiations go on with Senator Manchin and Sinema, although the sticking point now appears to be Senator Manchin, and just let him have the pen. And so, for better or for worse, that is sort of where things are headed. I think, other tax things that we're working on, we're still waiting on what the top line number will be for the appropriations bill this year. That will determine a variety of other priorities that are also, covered in BBB, like the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. So I think some decisions need to be made as far as should we try to tack on CTC and EITC to the omnibus, or just sort of hope that we can get Build Back Better across the finish line. And so that's sort of where we stand. And then the last thing I'll say, I know this was brief, but sort of the way things have been going recently is it moves very slowly, and there's very little information coming, reliable information, until the floodgates open, everything happens in 2 days, and you get all the information you've been looking for months all at once. So we're kind of in this quiet period right now. So the other thing I would say is that so I mean, we're just sort of in a quiet period. I don't have a lot of reliable information. Oh yeah, so the one thing I was going to say is that whatever does come out of this Manchin leadership process, the package will be substantially smaller. So as you all have seen, Manchin has been supportive of. He's voiced support for some of the climate provisions in Build Back Better, some healthcare provisions, and a variety of other provisions. But ultimately, the final package will be much smaller, I'm betting, than the 1.7 trillion that was put on the floor late last year. And so I think what that means is, some of the revenue raising provisions that drew a lot of controversy will kind of rise to the top of the list in terms of what gets crossed out. And so, I know that Ways and Means staff, they are taking meetings, from stakeholders about, some of the revenue raising measures that really drew a lot of controversy last year. I know that's happening now. There's nothing official in the works, but that they can say, or that we can, or really I can say from our point of view. But I know that those meetings do make a lot of difference in the end once the rubber really starts meeting the road. And so, to the extent that, groups can start laying the groundwork and making sure that nothing is a surprise, in those final days when all of a sudden Build Back Better is back on the front page, you want to make sure that your issue is front of mind among committee staff and then other leaderships as well. And so I will leave it there. I know that wasn't that long, but as I said, there's just not a lot of reliable info right now.
Yeah, Dylan, that was excellent. Thank you. Appreciate that, and appreciate your hard work and your input. Anybody has a question, they can put it in the chat. I just wanted to comment that you've been very helpful to us, and we are working with members of Congress, your boss being one of those, to form a congressional family business caucus. We're very excited about that. Your boss really understands family businesses. We hope that he will chair it, or at least part of that caucus. We know that they all have a lot of things on their plate, but I would just wanted everyone on this call to know that you've been helpful. He's been helpful in the development of this caucus, which is at the early stages. But we really hope, again, this Congressional Family Business Caucus takes off, and that you and your boss are part of it. So thank you for your help and input on that as well.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else on the call have any questions or comments for Dylan?
If it's okay, I would just jump in real quick. You know, Dylan, we've met with you on several occasions, and I will echo what Pat said in terms of the support. We appreciate it. You guys are always willing to hear us out and take into consideration the proposals. You mentioned some of the controversial provisions, depending upon the revenue that's needed to be raised for the ultimate package, may be either cut out or cut down. One of the ones, and we talked to you about this the last time, and I'll talk to the group about it here more in a minute, but deals with the surtax on high net worth individuals and some of the kind of disparity between the treatment on estates and trusts versus ordinary income. Have you heard anything else beyond that, or kind of discussions about either tweaks to that proposal? You know, what have you heard on that specifically?
I wish I could give you some more reliable information here. Sadly, it's just that particular provision, really, I have heard very little from committee staff about. I know that they have been contacted about it. I know the concerns that we talked about have been raised with them. I just don't know where they've landed. All I can say is just repeat to say that, to the extent that you and others can raise your concerns with them now, I think that will pay dividends later. The last thing they want to hear is, 24 hours before the deadline, get a meeting about something they haven't heard about. So that's really my main advice. And again, Pat and Brandon, once I hear anything reliable, I'll be sure to loop you guys in.
Thank you, Dylan.
So thanks so much, Dylan. We really appreciate you being on the call today. Thank you, Rodney, for the introduction and for bringing him to the call. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Dylan.
So next, Russ Sullivan from the Brownstein Law Firm is going to talk to us about the Build Back Better Act and the wins that families achieved. And Russ is going to go ahead and share his slides. He has a few slides here.
All right, good afternoon. It's great to be with you all again here in 2022. Pat talked at the beginning about what we've been working on, that you all have funded our efforts in Washington, D.C., and the extent to which we were reaching out. I want to go in a little more depth because I do want you to understand both our strategy and most importantly, how Pat Soldano led that effort and pushed us to do things that actually produced results. So you all will remember all the items we've talked about. I've listed 7 here of the provisions that would have adversely impacted multi-generational family businesses. I've got my nomenclature right from Frank Luntz, and each to a different degree. So some of these, it's unlikely that all of them would ever adversely impact every family-owned business, but some of them would have impacted virtually everyone. So we knew there was a big challenge ahead, but Pat sort of rounded it up and said, okay, we need a plan, and here's the plan. The plan is step 1, we're going to meet with as many policymakers as possible. We'll ask for meetings with members, staff, their legislative director, chief of staff, whoever's responsible for this, both from a policy perspective or a political perspective in the office. And she sent us out. And we asked for a lot of meetings. And you know what? Almost everybody that we asked for a meeting gave us a meeting. There may be a few exceptions, but they really did. You'll see we met with more Democrats than Republicans. That's because this bill was being written principally by the Democrats. If you're not going to vote for the bill, then you don't get much input into what's in the bill. However, she was smart enough to tell us, look, we got to meet with some Republicans too. They are ones who can echo the concerns that we have. They can write papers, write op-eds, they can raise issues. This is what Chairman Brady did, or former Chairman Brady did at the Ways and Means Committee. Republican, helped highlight some of the challenges and problems with the estate and wealth tax provisions. So after we were doing that, as we were doing that, we were sort of identifying who are the potential champions here? Who is willing to stand up? Frank talked about Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, but there were others that we identified that like they really didn't agree with what was being proposed, at least one or more of the provisions. We didn't say we won't work with you if unless you are willing to fight against all 8 of them. But if they just had 1 or 2 that they were willing to step out and challenge their party and come out publicly against and work behind the scenes, we agreed to work with them. So these are some of the ones that we reached out on various issues. Then we got direct and we said, we're asking you to get rid of step up in basis. We're asking you to get rid of the changes and limitations on the section 199A 20% pass-through deduction. We're asking you to get rid of the limitations on large IRAs. And here's where Pat sent us. She sent us to different ones. Not only the members that we set up that I just talked about, all those meetings, she sent me to Phoenix, Arizona to chase down Senator Sinema and to attend a weekend retreat, policy retreat that she has for some of her supporters to talk to her about that. And so I did. She tasked Squire Patton Boggs with coordinating with the Family Business Estate Tax Coalition and working with them to plant seeds, to plant bombs, to help identify people who would work with us to eliminate these provisions. And Pat was on every call that we set up with anybody on the Hill. There may have been some times we certainly talked to everybody we knew, but Pat showed up 100 times to lobby against these provisions on your behalf. And so we were going everywhere, doing everything we can. And guess what? With all that hard work, we actually found some people who would help us, and we got some results. The first big step was when House Agriculture Chairman David Scott came out and said, this inheritance tax stuff, I don't like the capital gains. I don't like any of this. This is going to hurt young, beginning, and disadvantaged farmers. We want to try to help young people and people of color to actually get in the business, start new businesses, and then be able to keep them in their families. He organized a letter for the Democrats on his committee expressing opposition to the provisions. Then we found Senator Tester. After talking to him, he was willing to come out publicly to Schumer and Wyden. I cannot support the proposed changes to step up in basis. People criticized him after he did this, but guess what? Then some other people joined him. 4 or 5 other senators stepped up and either publicly or privately said, we're with him. We're not going to vote for it. I talked with Senator Schumer's office and they said, you know what? There are 5 Democratic senators who don't want these estate tax provisions in here. And they also said that Tester's leadership on criticizing stepped up basis helped them to get rid of the other changes that related to the estate tax. And, the provision like having death be a taxable event, the rate changes and everything. And so that really helped get the ball rolling. Then we had Senator Manchin, who, I would say, he had some strong ideas from the very beginning, as you can tell by this document back in July, when he put some limits on what he would support. Now, he didn't say get rid of everything, but remember the proposal on capital gains was to go to 39.6%. And he said no more than 28%. So that was a step in the right direction. Look, we'll take it. We'll take a cap and then we'll work it down further. By the time the House took action, it was like 26.5%. And then finally, after our work with Senator Sinema, then she came out and sort of did a clean sweep. And she got rid of the capital gains rate totally, the 199, most of the estate and gift tax provisions, the top rate bracket. Now she didn't kill the net investment income tax and she didn't kill the surtax. But look, compared to where we started, we are in a situation where we have much fewer things that could adversely affect multi-generational family businesses. And, we were not the only group that was working against this. Some of it just sprung up from people reading about descriptions of the bill and calling their member of Congress. But a lot of it had to do with Pat Soldano and our group's leadership in mobilizing other groups and just taking it directly to the Hill to explain to them the problems and the practical implication of all of these bad policy ideas that came out of the Biden budget. So there you have it. Hopefully that gives you a little better flavor of what Pat's been having us do day and night for the last 4 months.
Well, thanks, Russ. You give me too much credit. I will say that with Squire Patton Boggs and the Brownstein Law Firm, we've had amazing success. They're great organizations to work with, all team members involved, and we've got 5, I think, from each firm. We have weekly calls, and I really appreciate and respect all the work they do. And what's most important is they work together also really well. So it's been a great team effort. And so now I want to turn it over to Brandon Ramon with Squire Patton Boggs, who's going to talk to us about the surtax and the thresholds around estate and gift and estate.
Thanks, Pat. And I think, again, just to echo what Russ said, Pat really is the fearless leader here, and we have really had a lot of success, but the job is never done. So as you'll see, I'm going to share my screen with you real quickly. As Russ mentioned, there's still a proposal in the current version of Build Back Better that deals with a surtax on high income individuals and their income. This proposal has been included really since the beginning, but it's kind of, there's a distinction, which I'll talk about here in a minute, which is something that's particularly important to family-owned businesses that operate through trust. And so the proposal effectively proposes an additional surtax on those who have adjusted gross income of over $10 million. It's a 5% surtax. There would then be an additional surtax on modified gross income, adjusted gross income over $25 million. But you'll see that I have 2 kind of sub bullet points here. And there's a distinction again in the thresholds at which that surtax would apply to modified adjusted gross income and income coming from a trust or an estate. So for 5%, surtax would apply on trusts and estates only $200,000. And then that additional 3% surtax would apply on trusts and estates of only $500,000, any income over that. So having done some diligence, again, obviously we realize this is a potentially big problem for members of PATG on the call and their businesses. So we did some additional diligence to try to understand where this proposal came from, why there is such a distinction. From what we have gathered, there's really no policy basis for this change. It's largely been done in a multiplier. I think right now it's about $13,150 under the current tax code, at which the top rate applies for trust and estates, as compared to $539,000 or so on the individual income side. And so the multiplier is a little bit more than 18 times is the number that they settled on, and they just applied that across the board in a general way to the trust and estates as well as relates to the surtax. Interestingly, and I think, Pat, you'll probably agree that as we've gone and had these meetings after the most recent iteration of the Build Back Better Act was released and marked up by the House Rules Committee that was sent to the House floor, a lot of people, including Democrats and Republicans, including even the Ways and Means members who have sit on the committee of jurisdiction over tax policy that drafted these proposals, were not aware of this distinction. So I think this has been a very helpful effort in the last several months, where we focused really in on this specific provision and talked about the need for, while we don't support the surtax, if the surtax is to go forward, emphasizing the need to make that the thresholds the same, because there's no, again, policy justification for treating them differently. And I think people have largely been receptive to that and understood. So then it comes down from, again, it's not, unfortunately, when it comes to tax policies and a proposal like this, it's not only about the policy itself, but it's about the revenue. And so I think, that was the reason I asked Dylan that question when he was discussing the updates on Build Back Better and where things were, is if he had heard anything about this proposal and specifically about the difference in the thresholds. And the reason I asked that is because, again, we know that the end product, if one does move forward, is going to be less costly than the $1.7 trillion. So there's a need for revenue, but how much revenue? And so I think it was helpful for us to hear that he has been told that the committee is discussing this and has heard about the concerns on the difference of the threshold levels. And thus, again, I think we are continuing to build support, raise awareness. What we don't know is how much revenue is raised between the change on the estate and trust side versus the change on the ordinary income side. That's not really broken down in the Joint Committee on Taxation's estimate of this proposal. That said, again, as he mentioned, I think this raises about just shy of $230 billion overall. The changes that were proposed in the proposal on high income individuals raise about $640 billion. So again, there will be some wiggle room to make changes around the edges or to proposals in whole as this does go forward. I think we are well positioned thanks to the leadership of Pat and the work that we've done with folks both on and off the tax writing committees and leadership to raise awareness here so that as this does move forward, in particular in the Senate with Senator Manchin having the pen, that people will know about this and know about the negative impact it will have on family businesses. So we're continuing to hammer this home. As Dylan mentioned, in terms of kind of where we sit right now, there's a lot of other priorities that are being discussed, and there's other areas of focus right now, both on the House side and on the Senate, which in addition to the competition bill, the voting rights, and the appropriations, the Senate will obviously also have to take time to deal with the nomination or forthcoming nomination of a new Supreme Court justice to fill that of retiring Justice Breyer. So lots of other things going on, but in the interim, we're continuing to raise awareness and advocate for the, if not full removal of the surtax, then at least the same treatment for estates and trusts as respects ordinary income. So that being said, Pat, that's kind of the summary of where things stand right now. We'll just say again, thanks to you for your leadership and thanks to all supporters for their support, both in terms of meeting and in terms of financially. We could not do it without you. And it's a really important fight that we're engaged on for family businesses around the country. So appreciate that. And I'll turn it back to you, Pat.
Well, thank you, Brandon. This has been very helpful and appreciate all your work as well. I can't emphasize enough what Brandon is saying. These trust thresholds, trust and estate thresholds, $200,000, you're going to pay an additional 5%, and over 500,000 additional 3% in income tax. These are still in the current legislation. Every meeting we've had, and we've had many, many of these meetings in which we bring up these thresholds, we ask the question, why are they in there? And we have no good intel. No one has a good answer, except they're 14 times the current exemption amount. So the reality is we bring these up, and I think many groups are not bringing up this issue because they don't really deal with trust and estates. We do deal with trust and estates. We understand it. And thanks to all of you on the phone and many others that are not on the phone with both law firms, you guys all discovered in the 1,600 pages these trust and estates thresholds. So we talk about it on every call because it is so important. And as I said, I think a lot of organizations don't do that. So it's still at play. And so pay attention. And if you have an opportunity, talk to your member of Congress about it. So now I want to turn it over to Mark Warren.
Pat, before we do that,
did you want to make a comment, Russ? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want everybody to understand that Pat still has us working very hard to kill this provision too. And there's really kind of good news this week. The longer this drags on, the more difficult it is for the Democrats to pass a really large bill. But we believe that Senator Manchin is now trying to work toward a much smaller bill than the $1.7 trillion bill. And it is possible that he's going to suggest to Leader Schumer and to President Biden that they do a bill that's really a fraction of that size, like 550 billion. It might contain only the energy tax provisions, the climate change spending funds that were in there, and it would be paid for at Manchin's suggestion by corporate and international tax provisions. Well, you can never just say you got one member suggesting one thing that's definitely going to happen. But Manchin has a lot of leverage because he and Sinema are the only two Democrats thus far, as Frank Luntz mentioned earlier, who've indicated they're very willing to vote no on this package, and then it won't have enough votes to pass. So if they do end up following what we understand may be Senator Manchin's suggestion, that could wall off and cause Democrats to drop all the individual tax increase provisions in the bill. So the surtax, net investment income tax, all of those. Now, that's not to say some won't try to get those in there. They can offer an amendment during the Senate consideration of the bill and a vote-a-rama. Everyone has a chance to offer an amendment. I suspect somebody's going to, but it is possible, more possible than we thought earlier, that we have a pathway to keep all the individual and pass through business provisions out of this bill. And that's our goal. That's our top goal. We may not achieve the whole thing, but that's what we're working toward now. And we do appreciate all of the contacts you all have made to your members in this regard, and keep at it.
Thanks, Russ. Totally agree with that. So Mark Warren, Brownstein Law Firm, is going to talk to us about valuation discount and other regulatory issues and what lies ahead.
Great, thanks, Pat. Brendan and Russ, did a really good job of describing the impressive successes that Pat's leadership has produced in the bill so far. And I agree with Russ that there is a positive outlook here for even getting rid of the surtax amounts. But through all of this, especially as we've kind of clocked in these successes, Pat's continued to really stress that we have to keep our eye around the next corner. Both from kind of moving beyond the congressional battleground, and in this case, really kind of looking beyond into sort of the regulatory side. So, I mean, coming at this from looking at the Biden administration and congressional Democrats, coming into office and power last year, really kind of built on an agenda that at that highest level was aimed at ensuring that high-income individuals and corporations are paying their fair share of taxes. So, a lot of that can be seen in the provisions that we've been able to work with all of you and with Pat's leadership to get out of the bill, but that were originally put on the table. But now as we move kind of hopefully to a successful outcome on the legislative side, we are anticipating that the administration is going to use its existing regulatory authority wherever they can to pick up some of these same issues as well as some others to advance their kind of the broader agenda of making sure that high-income individuals and businesses of really all sizes are paying their fair share. So, so we've started to kind of analyze and be prepared for what that might look like. And I think our next glimpse into kind of what Treasury's agenda might look like going into the future will be what's called the Priority Guidance Plan. And it's a list of regulatory projects. It's kind of a living list. There's one out at all times. It's usually issued in the kind of late spring or early summer. And it covers all the different areas of the tax code where Treasury plans to issue regulations, be it from newly enacted provisions to adjusting regulations for court cases, or other changes where the regulations have gotten out of date or where taxpayers need additional information in order to be able to comply with the rules for Treasury to be able to shut down tax shelters and abuses that have come up. So moving into this kind of field of battle, call it, there is a little bit of good news because we get a heads up. Under the Administrative Procedures Act, Treasury, like all agencies, has to give kind of notice of what they plan to do. And they typically do that by putting out proposed regulations. And then there's a comment period for the public and affected taxpayers to be able to submit their thoughts on it, objections, suggestions for revisions. And that usually runs from 30 to 90 days. And then Treasury takes all those comments and puts them together into kind of a final set of rules that they issue. And then those become effectively the law from a regulatory point of view. So if I could have the next slide. So in kind of trying to forecast what's out there, I think a starting point is to look at some of the provisions that were in the bill that we've been able to get knocked out, because I think Treasury will be thinking about, well, is there a way that we can, advance the ball on our policy objective in some of these lanes, through regulation that may not be quite as far along as what we could do in the statute, but still make some headway. And this first one on valuation discounts, which was an important provision in the bill that, Pat and you all were very successful in getting removed. It goes back to the Obama administration as well. They had a statutory proposal ran in their budget list of proposals for a number of years. And when they couldn't get it enacted, in August of 2016, they offered proposed regulations to do a fair amount of tightening on the valuation discount rules. Things like treating lapses of voting rights and liquidation rights as an additional transfer, or disregarding certain restrictions on liquidation. So it reduced the ability of businesses and families to use the valuation discount to get favorable results. When the Trump administration came in, they evaluated all of the regulations based on an executive order and found that the valuation discount really imposed an undue burden on small businesses and multi-generational family businesses. And in October of 2017, they withdrew them. But the concept is out there. So I think one of the risks that Pat has us keeping an eye on and concerned about is, does the Biden administration kind of decide to do something similar to the August 2016 Obama regulations, or with some modifications to put that kind of proposal out there. So that's probably kind of first and foremost what we're watching for. Another area in the bill that we were able to get removed dealt with grantor trusts. And there have been suggestions that Treasury could try through regulations and guidance, because the grantor trust rules are largely built on Treasury interpretation, that they could do some modifications there to provide additional limitations on grantor trusts. Similarly, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act increased the exemption amount under the estate and gift tax rules. That exemption amount drops back down at the end of 2025. And Treasury put in some rules to try to make sure that for multi-generational family businesses and others that took advantage of that higher exemption amount, that when it dropped back down, there wasn't an effort to try to claw that back. Those regulations were finalized, so they are currently the law. But it wouldn't surprise a lot of us if Treasury were to try to re-examine that, try to look for any ways that individuals may be abusing that shift in the exemption amount. So that'll be something that we'll be watching kind of closely. Now, outside of the estate and gift tax area, the 199A 20% deduction has been incredibly helpful for equalizing the kind of rate differential between pass-through businesses and corporations. And there are some limitations within that deduction, especially dealing with specified services businesses that were controversial when the Trump administration Treasury put out those rules. That may be something that Treasury might try to revisit. There have been some comments by Democrats that they thought that the relief in the Treasury regulations in 2018, 2019 were too generous. So that'll be another area that we're looking at. And the last one that I'll mention kind of goes to a package of legislative proposals that Finance Committee Chairman, Senate Finance Committee Chairman Senator Wyden from Oregon put out last summer that did not end up in the Build Back Better Act, but it's a package of partnership reforms, partnership tax rule reforms that were or are very expansive. And while Treasury wouldn't be able to go quite that far because it's would require statutory authority, that may be an area where they want to examine whether they can tighten those partnership rules and reduce some of those flexibilities. So kind of bottom line is, we've had great success, and kudos to Pat and thanks for her leadership, and kudos to all of you for the strong support. But we have to stay vigilant and kind of keep our eye on Treasury and make sure that they are also doing right by multi-generational family businesses, and we'll keep on that. So thank you, Pat. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Really appreciate it. If anybody has any questions, once again, put them in the Q&A or the chat. But we're almost at the end of our hour. Really appreciate everyone's participation. Really appreciate your support. We could not do this without you. We have great members and great supporters. The team, as I mentioned earlier, this is the best team I've ever had to work with in Washington, D.C. All of you have contributed so significantly, and I really do appreciate that. If you're on this call and you currently are not a supporter or a member, please go to our website and please join up. These calls are for our members and our supporters, and we really, really need that support in order to continue our good work. So if there's any other final comments anyone wants to make in this last minute or so, I guess that means Russ is not going to make a final comment. Okay.
We still got some work to do, so stay tuned.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have more of these calls throughout the year. So once again, appreciate everyone's support and your time on the call today. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.